Now this is going to upset some people, but I need to speak the truth as I see it. The exposure triangle is useless to teach people how to expose their image properly. There are lots of reasons that I'll go through. The major reason is that it doesn't explain the differences between those three options of ISO, aperture and shutter speed. The second reason is that ISO has got nothing to do with exposure. Well, I'll explain that a little bit more later on, but ISO can't be a measure of your exposure. So the exposure triangle has been made up by somebody, I don't know who, and a lot of YouTubers and photographers have taken it on and thought, well, that's a great concept, it looks really cool, I'll talk about the exposure triangle. But it doesn't explain the differences and the reasons why you would use one thing or the other. I could have a fruit triangle with an apple, a banana and an orange. It doesn't explain the differences between all of those options or why I should choose one or the other. So the exposure triangle, no matter how complicated you make it, doesn't help people understand exposure. It actually makes it more difficult the more complicated that exposure triangle gets. So I'm going to explain a more logical way for you to do it because I don't want this video to be a negative video. I want to be able to explain to you a better way to do it, an easier way to do it to understand exposure or how to expose your image properly.
You caught my eye, knew you were mine. Magic hit me like a heart in headlights, and I can't sleep at night with you on my mind. Can't say it gently, need you all the time.
Now I've taught thousands of photographers, both here in Australia and around the world, and I've never had anybody tell me that the exposure triangle has helped them understand exposure. It just doesn't. It's a cool concept, but it just doesn't work. Now this video is going to be a simple video about exposure. We're not going too deeply into the other consequences of using these particular functions. We're just talking about exposure. So exposure is the amount of light that hits your sensor. We can vary the amount of light that hits our sensor, and the more light that hits our sensor, the brighter our picture will be. This stuff is very logical. So there are two ways that we can control how much light hits our sensor. One is with our shutter speed and the other one is with our aperture.
And let it go, all my friends know. Scream from the rooftops how I want you so. And I'm low, 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 low when I'm alone. How did you do it on losing control?
Now I'm going to explain shutter speed to you using this old film camera. This is a Nikon FM3 that I used to use back in the days when I was starting professional photography. So the shutter in this camera is this little rectangular thing here. A shutter in a camera is just like a shutter on a window. When you close it, it stops the light. When you open it, it allows the light through. With our shutter in our camera, we can vary the amount of time that that shutter's open for. When we push the button to take our picture, our shutter opens, allows the light to come through onto our sensor, or film in this case, and then it closes off again. So the amount of time that we have that shutter open varies the amount of light that gets in and varies the exposure that we have. So with our shutter speed, we can make it very fast. If you have a look at that little sensor there, you'll see that it opened and closed, but you couldn't notice it because it was just so fast. That's 1/4000th of a second. I can reduce that down to 1/100th of a second. Here we go. It's a little bit easier to see it open and close, but it's still very difficult to see the difference between those two. But 1/100th of a second is much slower than 1/4000th of a second. So it's allowing more light through, making our picture brighter. I can drop this down to 1/4 of a second. So when we open this shutter, you'll hear it open for 1/4 of a second. Okay, there we go. We're letting more light in, allowing more light to hit our sensor, and our picture's getting brighter. This one goes down to 1 second. So we can have that shutter open for 1 second. Your camera goes much slower than that. So shutter speed varies how much light gets into our camera, onto our sensor, and makes our picture brighter or darker. The slower our shutter speed, the more light gets in, the brighter our picture will be. This stuff is very logical.
It's so good, it's a fable. Only dreams could make it. Let's put it all on the table. Just come out and say it.
Okay? The second way that we can control how much light gets into our camera is with our aperture. Now, aperture means a hole. If you've got a hole in your fence, you've got an aperture in your fence. There's a hole inside your lens that you can make larger or smaller, depending on how much light you want to control. So a large aperture will let more light in, a small aperture will let less light in. Some people call it f-stop rather than aperture. I find aperture a more descriptive word, so I prefer that. But you'll hear people refer to it as f-stop because it has an F in front of it. We have various numbers of aperture, say f5.6, f8, f11, and that will determine the size of that hole. Now, the difficulty of these numbers is that they seem to be reversed. So a large hole will be a small number, and a small hole will be a large number. So it's quite a difficult concept to get in your head to start with. I had a young fellow in a class a few years ago who explained to me that's what the F's for. I'm not going to say the word in this video because I might get banned off YouTube, but think of it as a F system. Okay, and that will help you to understand why those numbers are back to front. Or not why they are, but understand that those numbers are back to front. Okay, it'll take you a little while to get that in your head. But logically, the more light we get into our camera, the brighter our picture will be. The less light we get into our camera, the darker our picture will be. So these are the controls that control our exposure. Now, our ISO doesn't control our exposure, as I mentioned before. Our ISO is a post-production thing. Our camera's processor increases the brightness or decreases the brightness depending on what ISO we have on it. And it's done after you take the photograph. So if I've got an ISO set to 800, my camera's basic ISO setting may be 200, and my sensor doesn't change. My sensor always stays at 200 ISO. So I take that photograph at 200 ISO, but then my camera's processor immediately boosts that signal up to 800 ISO and brightens the picture. So your ISO controls the brightness of your photograph, just as a post-production thing, but it doesn't actually control the exposure of your image. So when I'm out taking a photograph, I will set my ISO to whatever the environment gives me. So if I'm shooting on a bright sunny day, I might shoot at 100 or 200 ISO. If I'm shooting in darker conditions on a heavily overcast day, I might shoot at 800 ISO. I generally leave it there for the whole time I'm at that location, because unless that light changes radically, it's not going to make a difference to my ISO. I leave it there. That means I only have two things to think about. I have my shutter speed and my aperture. Okay, it's much easier to juggle two things than it is to try and juggle three. Okay, so I take a photograph, my image is a bit too bright, so I will make my shutter speed faster to let less light in, or I make my aperture a little bit smaller to let less light in. It will have similar effect. Now, there are secondary considerations when we talk about apertures and shutter speeds, which we're not going to go into in this video. This is a simplified video. We're just talking about getting your exposure correct. Now, exposure is not a finite thing. There's no such thing as a perfect exposure because everyone likes images a little bit differently. We can all have our personal choice. I may like images a little bit brighter than you do. You've got the option to do this now. You can alter your aperture and shutter speed to get that image exposed the way that you like it. Okay? So it's a very personalized thing. But when you're shooting on manual settings, particularly, you can change your aperture and shutter speed to suit your own purposes, which is great. Now, just a little bit about the differences between a mirrorless camera and a DSLR camera. With a mirrorless camera, you have an electronic viewfinder, which gives you an image straight off your sensor. So as you change your aperture or shutter speed, that image will brighten or darken. So you can see through your viewfinder or on your LCD screen how bright your image is, which is an advantage and a disadvantage. I find a lot of people who are starting out with mirrorless cameras tend to just move the controls around until the image looks correctly exposed and then take it. They don't take any notice of the numbers, and the numbers are important. So you really need to know these numbers. With a DSLR or a digital SLR camera, we need to take a photograph and look at our LCD screen and think, well, that's too bright or that's too dark, and then we can alter it after that. Just a slightly different way of working.
You caught my eye, knew you were mine. Magic hit me like a heart in headlights, and I can't sleep at night with you on my mind. Can't say it gently.
way we change our aperture and our shutter speed and our ISO will vary between cameras. But on my camera here, as an example, I've got my shutter speed on the left and my aperture on the right. My aperture has an F in front of it, so that distinguishes between the two, and my ISO is underneath. So to change my shutter speed, I can simply turn my thumb wheel. Or if you have a finger wheel, you can change that on the top. That will change your shutter speed. To change my aperture, I have a wheel at the front of my camera that I can change that will change my aperture. Some cameras you need to depress a particular button and then use your thumb wheel to change that aperture. So it varies between cameras, but just check your camera manual and it'll show you how to change these apertures and shutter speeds. So the basic thing is when I take a photograph, I look at that, my thought process is that image is too bright, I need to get less light into the camera, so I'll either make my shutter speed faster or my aperture smaller. Very logical, very easy to understand. Okay, so hopefully you've got that. And practice. Practice is really important with this stuff.
Can't let it go. All my friends know. Scream from the rooftops how I want you so. When I'm low, 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 low. When I'm alone. How did you do it on losing control?
I know there's a big debate about whether you should use manual or whether you should use auto exposure. My opinion is, and it's been formed over 40 years of photography, that you're much better off to learn these manual settings because in the future you're going to be able to understand things so much more easily. When you get into flash photography, where your apertures and shutter speeds really make a difference, when you get into night photography or sport photography, you're going to be able to understand the reasons why you use particular settings, and it's going to make everything so much easier when you get into those more advanced techniques. So persist. It takes a little while to get it in your head. The more you practice, the quicker it's going to be. Now, this is exactly how I work. If I was going outside today to take a family portrait, I would go outside, set settings that I think are close, take a shot. Well, that image is a little bit too dark, so I'll just either lengthen my shutter speed or reduce my aperture size, and that will give me a perfect exposure. I might need to do it a couple of times to get it right. But then I just use those same settings for that whole session. Unless my light changes, unless the sun comes out, or unless darker clouds come over and it makes it a little bit darker. But it's a simple technique to be able to use. Now, the words that you use in your head to describe this stuff make a big difference to how easily you can get it. Try to use descriptive words. When you're thinking about shutter speeds, think about faster or slower, because it's descriptive. A faster shutter speed lets less light in, makes my picture darker. When you're thinking about apertures, think about larger or smaller, because again, it's logical. A larger aperture will let more light in, a smaller aperture will let less light in. This will make it so much easier for you to get this stuff. Okay, so hopefully you understand that. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below. If you agree with me, let me know. If you don't agree with me, let me know. As I said, this is a simple video. We're just talking about exposure. So we're talking about the reasons why the exposure triangle doesn't work, and I've explained a better, more logical way from my point of view. So there are other considerations that we can play with. We're going to put more videos together in the future that will explain those things, the secondary options for aperture and shutter speed and ISO, plus a whole lot of other stuff. So keep tuned for more videos in the future, and hopefully I can make this stuff simpler, more logical, and more fun.